In May 1881, a rather curious case came before the Old Bailey, the top criminal court in London. A merchant sailor, Captain George Drevar, was accused of sending threatening letters to the Commissioner of Wreck, the official in charge of investigating shipwrecks, Henry Callaghan Rothery. Rothery presided over an inquest into the grounding of the ship Norfolk, captained by Drevar, on the Hartwell Reef in the Cape Verde Islands, which had resulted in the suspension of Drevar's captain's licence. Drevar seems to have very strongly resented the outcome of the inquiry, which he regarded as unfair. But the outcome of the wreck inquiry was not the sole bone of contention with the Commissioner. Some evidence was given showing that the prisoner believed in the existence of the sea serpent. So what led the captain to the Old Bailey? And what has sea serpents got to do with it? For that we must delve more deeply into the curious life and times of the aforementioned George Drevar, the sea serpent monomaniac, would-be murderer, evangelist, and ultimately hero. If you're interested in discussion of science, statistics and sea monsters with a scholarly rigour and a bit of history, then welcome to Looking for Leviathans. To understand the context of the Drevar trial, we must first consider the status of great sea serpents in the 19th century. Sea serpents have been reported off Scotland in 1808, and there have been a large number of reports off New England in the period 1817 to 1821. Then sea serpents were reported intermittently until the middle of the century, when they started to be then reported on a fairly regular basis, reaching a peak, at least off the coast of Scotland, in the 1890s. Scientists and the public debated their existence, with a gradual trend towards scientific scepticism as the century progressed. This scientific scepticism really started in the UK, at least, in 1848, with the scientific response to a very prominent report by the officers and crew of HMS Daedalus, a sighting which I'll deal with in a later episode. The British press felt the sighting by upstanding Royal Naval officers rather than dubious Yankees finally vindicated the existence of the sea serpent. Yet some, but by no means all scientists, disagreed. Sir Richard Owen, coiner of the term dinosaur and founder of the Natural History Museum in London, said a larger body of evidence from eyewitnesses might be got together in proof of ghosts than of the sea serpent. So with the Victorian public and scientific opinion divided on the existence of the sea serpent, we have the trial of George Drevar in 1881. The trial might have been in 1881, but the origins date back many years before this, in a tale of shipwreck, ship abandonment, sperm whales, sea serpents, sea snakes, ground nuts, before ultimately another shipwreck and the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, the Old Bailey. The evidence suggests that George Drevar was born in Dublin in 1833, possibly a scion of the prominent Drevar merchant family, though in the later Times article he is described as a Scotchman. He became an apprentice in 1849 and received his second and third mate certificates in 1856 and 1857 respectively. By 1855 he had his first experience of shipwreck. He was stranded for 6 months in the island of Agaliga, which is in the Mauritius Islands. He then commanded a brig off the Australian coast between 1862 and 1863, but by late 1863 he was in England, where he took the Shamrock, apparently only 28 tons, all the way from Plymouth to Cuba. In 1864 he was master of the Diva out of Rangora in Australia, and by 1870 he commanded the Como. This foundered in mid-ocean because of shifting cargo, causing the crew to abandon ship. They were rescued, fortunately, by another passing vessel. In the process, Drevar ordered the decking cut off the bridge house to act as a buoyancy device for the crew. This was Drevar's first known interest in constructing life-saving gear in situ, an interest that would continue to the end of his life. As we shall see, this experience had a great impact on Drevar. By June 1871, Drevar was captain of the Pauline, an American-built barque of 587 tons, principal owner G.C. Trefont. It was in the summer of 1875 that the Pauline left Newcastle en route to Zanzibar. This apparently required crossing the Atlantic, possibly to take advantage of the southeasterly trade winds. So in July 1875, the Pauline found itself off the coast of Cape St. Roque, Brazil, where she encountered the great sea serpent. The earliest published account of the encounter occurs on the 17th of November 1875. The news that the Pauline had arrived in Zanzibar in October, and the crew had spoken to the naval officers there, and the naval officers were convinced of the truth of the story. A fuller account, albeit second-hand, comes in a letter and sketch sent to the Illustrated London News by the Reverend E.L. Penny, chaplain to HMS London, who were in Zanzibar, and who had met with the crew of the Pauline on their arrival. Penny did a drawing based on what Drevar had actually told him. And the image is kind of interesting because if the Pauline was 20 miles off the coast, as one account of the affair has suggested, actually a coastline wouldn't really be visible. It took a while for the first-hand accounts to emerge. The second officer gave an account, and then finally Drevar himself gave an account, which now follows.
The weather fine and clear, wind and sea moderate. About 1/2 mile to windward, we observed some black spots on the water and a whitish pillar about 30 feet high above them. The sea was also splashing up fountain-like several hundred yards around them. At first glance I thought they were breakers, and the pillar a pinnacle rock bleached with the sun. But the pillar fell with a splash, and rose and fell frequently. Good glasses showed me that it was a monster sea snake, coiled twice around the body of a large sperm whale, the head and tail part of the snake, each about 30 feet long, forming a lever, crushing its victim to death with each revolution, and appearing, as each portion alternatively rose in the air, like the arms of some gigantic windmill, and about the same speed as would do in a fresh breeze. They both sank about every 2 minutes, remaining that time under water, and then coming to the surface, both still revolving. The struggle of the whale and 2 other whales near at hand lashing the water, frantic with excitement, made the sea in their vicinity like a boiling cauldron, and the confused noise was distinctly heard. The struggle lasted about 15 minutes, and finished with the tail portion of the whale elevated straight into the air, waving backwards and forwards, and the tail furiously lashing the water in the last death struggle as it disappeared from our view, and sinking down head foremost, no doubt was soon gorged at the monster's leisure, and the huge mouthful may at this moment be in the process of digestion, and the monster of monsters in a dormant state. 2 of the largest sperm whales I have seen came slowly towards a vessel. Their bodies were more than usually elevated out of the water. They were not blowing or making a noise, but seemed quite paralyzed from the fearful sight. Indeed, a cold shiver passed through my frame on witnessing the last agonizing struggle of the poor whale, which seemed as helpless in the coils of the serpent as a small bird in the talons of the hawk. Allowing for the 2 turns around the whale, I think the snake was about 160 feet long and 7 or 8 feet in the girth. In colour and shape, it was like a conger eel. I'm aware that few believe in the existence of the great sea serpent. People think that it should be oftener seen by the numerous vessels always on the ocean, but the north coast of Brazil, noted for its monster reptiles, is also particularly adapted to the growth of sea monsters. It is in mid-torrid zone, the temperature of the water and air seldom below 81 degrees, the shore for 1,000 miles bordered by a coral wall. No doubt San Roque is a good feeding ground, it being a landmark for whales leaving the south for the North Atlantic and the warm currents suitable for breeding.
Penny's account revealed the serpent was seen twice more later. On July 13th, this or another sea serpent was again seen about 200 yards off the stern of the vessel, shooting itself along the surface, 40 foot of its body being out of the water at a time. Again, on the same day, it was seen once more, with its body standing quite perpendicular out of the water to a height of 60 foot. This time it seemed as if determined to attack the vessel, and the crew and the officers armed themselves for self-defence. Captain Drevar is a singularly able and observant man, and those of his crew and officers with whom I conversed were singularly intelligent. Not Not did any of their descriptions vary from one to another in the least. There were no discrepancies. There are several interesting things about this account. Firstly, the crew saw the sea serpent locked in battle with the sperm whale, an interaction which is fairly rare in sea serpent accounts. And of course, the sea serpent was seen 3 times, which in the context of sea serpent accounts, again, is an extremely rare thing to actually occur. For one vessel to see the same sea serpent, or the same species of sea serpent, over a very, very short period of time. Drevar made another comment as well.
I sincerely believe God, for some wise purpose, has been pleased to reveal this greatest wonder of animated nature to me.
Drevar explicitly in his personal account relates the serpent to the Leviathan of the Book of Job. And that analogy is also made by the second officer as well in his account of the affair. So both of them think that their experience had religious connotations. No more details were forthcoming until the 10th and 11th of January 1877, when several newspapers published details in an affidavit of less detail than the previously given account, sworn before a magistrate, one T.S. Raffles, in Liverpool after the Pauline arrived in Liverpool. It was given by several of the crew, and it also breaks down who saw the sightings. The second sighting, the affidavit, says it was the captain and one ordinary seaman. And then of the final sighting, the third sighting, it was seen by the chief officer and the 3 able seamen. It was also stated that Captain Drevar was intending to contact various scientific bodies in London to talk about his experience. The accounts, this account was widely reprinted in newspapers, despite the account being quite old by this stage, 2 years after the event. I've not yet found any record of Drevar actually addressing any scientific societies at the time, though we do know that he corresponded with some scientists, notably Philip H. Goss, the author of a phenomenally popular book called The Romance of Natural History in 1877, and also with Albert Gunter, who was the curator at the Natural History Museum. And this happened when Drevar says after he settled in London, so it would have been in the period 1880 to 1882. Finally, 1 month later, we actually get Drevar's own sketches of the Pauline incident, which are kind of interesting, slightly less artistic than E.L. Penny's images, but perhaps more revealing of what was actually seen. Although it's very clear that Drevar's interpretation of what was seen was a sea serpent wrapped around a sperm whale. Drevar made another final comment on his sighting in 1883 in a letter to a sea serpent skeptic, Henry Lee, the author of a book called Sea Monsters Unmasked, where he again confessed his complete belief in the fact he actually had seen a sea serpent.
You may rely on my report as strictly true and in no way exaggerated. I called the second officer out of his bed to witness the conflict, and he remarked at the time that had the occurrence been further off, he would have concluded that it was a swordfish and a thrasher fighting a whale, which he thought he saw on his first voyage to sea. Several shipmasters told me that they had seen the same conflict near the locality that I saw it, but had not been close enough to see the coils. They thought it was 2 separate fish fighting the whale, but were satisfied that it might have been the head and tail portion of a huge serpent about the whale.
So seeing sea serpents off Brazil was commonplace. So what did Drevar and the crew of the Pauline actually see? Well, there have been a number of hypotheses, some plausible, some less plausible, suggested over the past century and a half since the Pauline incident. And here I've tried to tabulate the different hypotheses. And as we can see, in the first column, we have the features noted by Drevar, and then we have various different hypotheses in columns for what was actually seen. We've got the sea serpent hypothesis, the hypothesis of Drevar himself. we got the hypothesis perhaps of Sir Richard Owen and my colleague Adrian Shine, that what was actually seen wasn't sperm whales, but actually was humpback whales, and maybe they were mating, and they embraced with their flippers around each other. So what was seen as being a serpent was in fact the enveloping flippers of the humpback whales in embracing each other. A hypothesis I'll talk about slightly more in a later hypothesis was suggested by myself and my colleagues with regard to another sea serpent sighting from off Greenland, which was that in fact that the males which are mating again might display their genitalia and might be seen pointing out of the water, and this might be mistaken by a naive viewer as a serpent, the head and neck of a serpent, when in fact it's just the penis of a whale. Another plausible hypothesis, I think, is the idea that the sperm whales were feeding. They were feeding off giant squid, and this was a suggestion by the ichthyologist Henry Lee way back in the 19th century. And what was being seen was a giant squid, in fact, fighting for its life, having been attacked and been swallowed by the sperm whale. And so what was interpreted as the coils of a snake wrapped around the body of the sperm whale was in fact the desperate labours of the giant squid, its tentacles flailing as it was being swallowed by the sperm whale. A hypothesis promoted for a lot of sea serpent sightings historically by Robert France, an ecologist from Canada, is that what people are seeing are a marine megafauna, probably in this case a whale, entangled in human debris, typically fishing debris, netting, rope, etc., etc. The great advantage of this hypothesis, like the sea serpent hypothesis in fact, is that it can explain a lot. And in fact, of course, you can explain an animal attached to debris can explain almost any observed phenomena from a sighting. In some ways, this is a strength. In other ways, it is a weakness because you can sort of explain everything. Slightly more exotic suggestions were made for the Pauline sea serpent as well. There were mosasaurs in the early part of the 20th century. That what was actually seen was a mosasaur, a marine lizards from the Cretaceous period that grew to great lengths. None of them are known to have a mode of feeding which would involve them wrapping around other megafauna like a constricting snake, though. So that would seem a very implausible hypothesis. And then another hypothesis that again was made in the 19th century was that what was actually seen was a primitive sort of whale of an elongate shape called a Basilosaurus, also known as a Zeuglodon. Again, though, it wouldn't necessarily be wrapping itself around its prey, and preying on sperm whales would seem a fairly high-risk strategy. So I think we can probably discount the mosasaur and Basilosaurus hypotheses. And then we're left then with a sea serpent-like species, the whales mating and embracing each other hypothesis, the whales mating and a penis being seen, and sperm whales attacking a giant squid or whales entangled. The whales mating hypothesis and embracing really assumes that Drevar got the species identification wrong, and it was a humpback whale rather than a sperm whale. The supporters of this hypothesis would argue that the animal actually as seen in the Drevar diagrams could be reconcilable with a humpback whale. This is true, but Drevar had spent a lot of time at sea, so maybe he was very, very good at recognizing sperm whales. Again, we don't necessarily need to have the same hypothesis for all three sightings of the Pauline sea serpent. Maybe different things were seen each time, but because of preconceptions, it was perceived as being the same sort of animal. Of course, the sea serpent interpretation has the kind of greatest explanatory power because it kind of fits everything that Drevar described. But of course, when he described what he'd seen, he described it in the light of assuming there was a sea serpent. So it's not necessarily surprising that that hypothesis has the most explanatory power. Ultimately, we don't have an absolute answer. There was no DNA collected from the scene. So depending on how you evaluate the evidence for yourself will perhaps determine you, the viewer's final determination of what the species actually was. For me, my gut feeling is that it was probably a sperm whale feeding off giant squid. That's my preferred hypothesis for the first sighting. I'm a lot less sure about the second and third sighting because that seems biologically rather difficult to justify. The fact that so much of the body was seen out of the water, if the size is as estimated by the viewers by the witnesses was actually correct. So there's still a mystery there, and maybe someone else will come up with a new solution to the Pauline sea serpent, which is overwhelmingly convincing. But for the moment, no one really knows for sure. And this also hints at another question, which we'll return to later on in this series, which is what constitutes a good explanation for an experienced strange phenomena? And that is a non-trivial question. Drevar had no personal doubt. He'd seen a gigantic sea serpent, a snake, basically with affinities of the smaller tropical venomous marine snakes that you find in the Indian Ocean and around the coast of Australia. But in fact, the zoological implications of what he'd seen was of far less importance to him than the religious implications. And this becomes clearer later on when he explicitly talks about how it's been revealed to him the Leviathan of the Book of Job. And he talks about this in some detail in a leaflet that he produced in 1889. After he stopped captaining the Pauline, he seems to have taken some time off, and then he went to India and took command of and part-owned the Norfolk, 953 tons. During this period, and this shows again how much the sea serpent experience had affected him, he starts collecting specimens of sea snake. Whenever he encounters a sea snake, he'll collect them. And this is something he refers to later on in his life. So he took command of the Norfolk, and then when visiting the Cape Verde Islands, it strands. An interesting indication of Drevar's priorities at this time was a revelation he made in 1889, that one of his priorities when the Norfolk stranded was actually to ensure that he secured his specimens of sea snake from the wreck. And he did this by finding another wreck on the same reef where the Norfolk had wrecked, and he purloined some rum that was apparently on board that vessel. I'd love to know far more about the details of the stranding. We do know a little about the details of the stranding from the wreck investigation of 1879. And it appears that the stranding was caused by a combination of unfortunate events. Drevar, as the captain, had determined a course which took the boat straight onto the reef rather than avoid it. This by itself probably wouldn't have caused the wreck. Obviously, a lookout would have spotted the reef, and steps could be made to ensure that the boat actually didn't encounter the reef. However, the ship's cargo of ground nuts had apparently managed to get everywhere on board the ship and had blocked the pumps. And so the ship was taking on too much water, even prior to colliding with the reef. And so the lookout was taken from his primary duty in order to man the pumps to try and stop the boat taking on too much water. And because there wasn't anybody being a lookout, then the collision with the reef couldn't be avoided. And the wreck commissioner's report stated that the two people who had most responsibility as the commanding officers was Drevar and the second officer. Drevar actually wasn't on duty when this all happened. He presumably was asleep or something. The second officer had disappeared and apparently had an alcohol problem. But the result, at least for Drevar, of the wreck inquiry in 1879 was that his license was suspended for 6 months. And this inquiry outcome clearly caused some considerable stress to Drevar. And there appears to be some sort of lost communication between him and Rothery, the Commissioner of Wreck, where somehow or other Drevar's belief in the sea serpent was debated. It's not alluded to in the Commissioner's report, so it's unclear exactly what was talked about. The other bone of contention that Drevar had with the Wreck Commissioner was that the log book of the Pauline had been kept by the authorities. And Drevar seems to have felt that if he kind of had access to that logbook, he could have proven that he had no responsibility for what happened to the Norfolk. Therefore, motivated by a sense of injustice, desirous of the return of his logbook, and apparently hurt by negative allusions to his belief in the sea serpent, Drevar seems to have started writing letters to Rothery, as well as the head of maritime affairs at the Board of Trade, Thomas Gray, and for some reason which is entirely unclear to me, the Colonial Secretary, the Earl of Kimberley. I'm totally unclear what the connection of the Earl is to the affair. Now, all of these letters apparently contain threats. What was in the letters can only be gleaned from the newspaper reports. Detailed account of the court proceedings are not available. Apparently, the first letter to Rothery was sent on the 25th of November, 1879. Then Drevar wrote another letter to Rothery expressing regret for what he'd done. But then he started writing more letters in the early 1880, calling, amongst other things, Rothery an unfeeling brute. And then he wrote another letter and he demanded recompense, employment, or an asylum if his requests were not granted. And then, slightly more sinisterly, he would charge his blood and that of another on the nation that had so cruelly wronged him. And he also called Rothery a modern Jesuit. The fact that these letters kept on coming eventually caused a response by the authorities, and on the 12th of April 1881, Drevar was arrested by Inspector Swanson of Scotland Yard, the policeman who would later lead the investigation into Jack the Ripper. And on that cliffhanger, I end the first episode of Looking for Leviathans, with a lot more planned. Immediate future episodes will finish the incredible story of George Drevar, and it does get stranger, reveal the link of sea serpents to whale penises, discuss the identity of a strange sea monk found off the coast of Denmark in 1546, explore different hypotheses for the Loch Ness Monster, and reveal the actual unsquiddy history of the Kraken. Subscribe if you dare.